A dangerous South American street gang, Tren de Aragua, has rapidly gained a foothold in New York City, exploiting the migrant crisis to build a violent criminal empire. Originally from Venezuela, the gang has infiltrated city shelters, running illegal operations like drug trafficking, armed robberies, and prostitution right under the noses of authorities. Their influence stretches from Jackson Heights, Roosevelt Avenue, where migrant prostitutes now walk the streets day and night, to Randall's Island, an epicenter of their operations. Tren de Aragua uses clever tactics to blend in. Gang members disguise themselves as food delivery workers, riding mopeds and carrying delivery bags filled with drugs and weapons, allowing them to commit crimes while hiding in plain sight. Recently, a 24-hour brothel was busted by NYPD, with sources suggesting it was linked to the gang. The gang preys on vulnerable young migrants, forcing them into criminal activity. Many members are as young as 15 and operate in groups, committing violent robberies across the city. In one recent spree, a man was brutally beaten and robbed by a group of 10 gang members for his phone and valuables. Another victim, relaxing in Central Park, was held at knife point and forced to give up his phone and $80. Tren de Aragua has no issue about targeting average New Yorkers and even law enforcement. In June, 19-year-old gang member Bernardo Castro Mata was arrested for shooting 2 NYPD officers. Another teen, just 15 years old, opened fire on tourists in Times Square earlier this year. Randall's Island, where a large tent city has been set up to accommodate migrants, has become a recruitment hub for the gang. Tren de Aragua uses fear tactics to strong-arm migrants into joining, threatening their families back home if they resist. For those who refuse, they're labeled enemies of the gang. Now, with its reach extending beyond New York into places like New Jersey, the gang is becoming an even bigger threat. As the city struggles to contain this dangerous organization, both residents and police are left on edge.
America has allowed gangs to enter our country.
The migrants that are coming, they're taking over every block right now.
The city of Chicago is going to go up in smoke, it's going to go up in flame.
Gangs in Chicago are angry over the influx of migrants and criminals in their city. They say money that should be going to the African-American community on the South Side is instead going to what they call non-citizens, and warn that turf wars between Chicago's gangs and groups like Venezuela's Tren de Aragua could see Chicago, quote, go up in flames. Photographer Matt McDermott and I traveled to Chicago's South Side to see what was happening for ourselves after we heard about a police report last month that the Tren de Aragua gang had taken over an office building there. We spoke to a number of young, hardcore gang members, as well as gang elders who have retired from the life, and just regular citizens who are very much part of the community. And they're all furious at the estimated $500 million that's reportedly been funneled toward new migrants in Chicago since 2022. And they aren't happy either about what they say are Venezuelan criminal gangs that are leaving the shelters and spilling out into the South Side into abandoned buildings. I spoke to Tyrone Muhammad of Ex-Cons for Trump, who runs a street patrol and violence prevention program. He's gone straight since his days as an enforcer for the Gangster Disciples. And he said the situation is very tense on the South Side as turf battles between the local gangs and Venezuelan migrants heat up.
It is impossible to release gang members and criminals into our country through the borders and broken walls, and infiltrate them in our community that's already impoverished, that's already broken, that's already disinvested. And when the black gangs, the leadership in the black gangs in Chicago get fed up with the illegalities and the criminal activity of these migrants or non-citizens, the city of Chicago is going to go up in smoke, it's going to go up in flame, and there's going to be nothing that the National Guard or our government can do about it when the bloodshed hit the streets, blacks against migrants.
Zach Massey did time in state prison with Tyrone Muhammad, although he's only 27. He's a leader on the streets and said he's disgusted by the money going to Venezuelan migrants at the expense, he says, of the African-American community.
I finally actually talked to him on the translator app, and he told me all the things that he got going on, how they help him get a car, apartment, clothes, link. So it's just like, I just be looking at it like they ain't got no social security number. Where they come from? He probably not even here legally.
They get right here. They get quick housing, quick funding, food. They get cars with no license. They can't even read English and stuff like that. So they get all these perks when they get here, and we still here starving. So what we gonna do about it? Are y'all gonna listen to our cries?
Corey Rogers was a Blackstone gang member for years. He drove us around the South Side and showed us areas where he said Trende Aragua and other criminal gangs are setting up shop and what he called showing the flag, which means brandishing their weapons in front of like a housing project.
The migrants that are coming, they're taking over every block right now in this area. Right now, you don't see them because they come out at night. They said they took this courtway over probably about last week. He said it was 100 Venezuelans standing out in the front right here.
Terry, is it an abandoned building? How do they just take it over?
They just, when you take over something, you just stand outside, and that's called showing the flag.
What kind of guns do they have?
Semi-automatics, anything you name, you're gonna see it on the street. These boys got so many big guns that if they're 150 pounds, the gun is bigger than them. I swear.
But they know how to handle it, right? They know it. Tell me about the fact that they're criminals, right? This is a criminal element. These aren't just a bunch of Venezuelans that walked over the border and used to be gardeners back home, right?
Right. And they come from the gangland. They come from rougher gangs than us.
One gang member who only gave his name as David on a particularly dangerous drug dealing corner on the South Side did not hold back when he talked about the influx of criminal gangs from other countries into Chicago.
The real issue is that America has allowed gangs to enter our country. Gangs that they would consider terrorist groups that are formed here. We are terrorist groups if we're in a gang. They let terrorists in our country.
Taken out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the nearby suburb of Charleroi.
That's right.
Yeah, residents are divided on where they stand with the influx of Haitian migrants.
And on one side are some business owners saying Haitian migrants there are filling jobs Americans do not want, helping the economy there. On the other side, local residents speaking out against it.
Host of American Agenda, Bob Brooks, is live in Charleroi. He has more. Bob, good morning.
Good morning, Sean and Katie. Look, the reason I'm here, I grew up about 30 minutes down the road. I'm from this region. It's heartbreaking to see what has happened time and time again. Look, Charleroi right now is a microcosm of what is happening all across the Rust Belt, across the region. Factories are shutting down here, like the one behind me. I'm going to talk about that. And then you have migrants coming into small towns all across the Rust Belt just as well. For instance, here in Charleroi, 4,000 people. City officials say they've got about 2,500 Haitian Liberian migrants. And then the residents here, they feel like they're being forgotten. They're losing their jobs. Then they feel like they're losing their town on top of it. So a vicious cycle, one that continues here. So basically what's happening, the plant behind me, Corel Brands, they make glass products. It's set to shut down, barring a miracle. Just before Labor Day, they had another plant shut down called Quality Pasta. Obviously, they're making pasta products there. They're going to lose anywhere from about 500 to 600 full-time paying jobs. That's going to destroy a small town like this. And I've seen this movie play out time and time again. 300 jobs here at this factory, 400, 100 at Quality Pasta. Then on top of it, the people here, they're dealing, Sean and Katie, with this migrant influx. And it just hasn't been easy on them to see. It hasn't been easy on the town. It hasn't been easy on anyone here that has lived here for decades. This was their home. Let's listen to what they have to say.
They shut this factory down. It's going to cripple this town and the Mon Valley.
I'm devastated because we own our house. We've lived here. We're family. We're going to lose everything down here. If this factory, I'm not saying in this town, I'm not. My child already lost 2 years of school. She's so far behind. She was supposed to go to Head Start, and they told her she couldn't go 2 weeks before school start because 20 immigrants came in and took her out of school. So we lost 2 years of school, so why would I want to stay in this town?
It's really sad what has happened to my hometown. I mean, it's hard for me to drive through here and just see what's left of it. And, you know, I've said before, this is beyond immigration. At this point, it feels like an invasion.
Requires federal intervention that local government is being asked to subsidize. Local government is not designed or built to handle such a crisis.
Definitely both a humanitarian crisis for the migrants that are arriving, and it is creating a fiscal crisis for the city.
I don't see an ending to this. This issue will destroy New York City.
The present migrant crisis is quite unprecedented, both in scale, in the diversity of the nationalities that are coming to the border, and the impact it's having not only on the border states, but in the states and cities inside the country.
I think it's at this point politically unsustainable for the Biden administration to maintain this unlimited flow into what's essentially a welfare state network of cities like New York and Denver and Chicago.
So how long can cities withstand the recent surge of migrants? And what do they need to end the crisis?
We have to first acknowledge that there is a crisis, because if you don't acknowledge a crisis, you can't be in a crisis mode. We have to be in a crisis mode.
And this crisis is expensive. In 2018, New York City spent roughly $258 million to fund its immigration services, adjusted for inflation. By fiscal year 2023, the city had spent $1.47 billion servicing those seeking asylum. The city of Chicago spent over $194 million on its new arrivals mission since October 2022. Denver is estimated to have spent between $36.3 million to $39.1 million on migrant support services in 2023.
The three biggest items for expenses for new arrivals is housing, education, and healthcare. And they're all three high-ticket items.
The idea that we could have a generous system of welfare benefits from health to education and so on, and allow the entire world to access those benefits is just mathematically impossible. So we're starting to see the math not adding up in state after state.
The sheer volume of newly arrived migrants is a major reason behind the city's struggles. In fiscal year 2022, just over 817,000 new cases were filed in immigration courts across the U.S. That number exploded to nearly 1.5 million new cases the following fiscal year. The particular background of current migrants also plays a role.
The secret sauce of migration has worked in the past is that people would come and they would not depend on the city and state for settling them. They would depend on their social networks. It seems in this case, many of the people coming in are coming where there are not such inbuilt connections. Venezuelans which is the largest source of a nationality of the new migrants. It's particularly true that they don't have inbuilt connections. They're not Venezuelan communities that are long standing. So they therefore, in the absence of private source of comfort for them, then they become dependent on the states and the cities. And the states and the cities have limited resources.
Although immigration has primarily been an area of federal oversight, experts say there just isn't enough federal funding for cities to work with.
The current level of federal funding provided to state and local governments is a drop in the bucket compared to the need. Congress has provided a very small amount of money of $800 million for a FEMA program for the entire country for last fiscal year to provide assistance to cities in aiding these newcomers.
But cities say this isn't enough. For instance, the $145 million allocated to New York City is less than 10% of what the city spent on migrant services in fiscal year 2023.
This is a whole spectrum of services needed for people who are new to a place, new to a country, new to a city. Everything from finding warm clothes for them, to finding jobs for them, to finding shelter for them. These are complicated issues to manage. So the city, the state, and the federal government, frankly, was not prepared for it.
Texas is providing charter buses to send these illegal immigrants who have been dropped off by the Biden administration to Washington, D.C. We are sending them to the United States Capitol, where the Biden administration will be able to more immediately address the needs of the people that they are allowing to come across our border.
So the historians will probably record the current migrant crisis as a chapter of busing migrants. This kind of coordinated, dramatic busing of asylum seekers from the border to the cities inside the countries is completely unprecedented.
Since the first bus of migrants to Washington, D.C., Texas reported it has transported over 100,000 migrants to cities such as New York City, Chicago, Philadelphia, Denver, and Los Angeles. In 2023, illegal immigration is estimated to have cost Texas taxpayers $13.4 billion. According to the Texas newsroom, the state spent over $148 million busing migrants to sanctuary cities as of January 24, 2024. The Office of the Governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, did not respond to CNBC's request for an interview.
The two motives, I think, behind it were, one, simply necessity that Texas doesn't have the resources to cope with 150,000 people a day being released into the state. It's a big state, it's a reasonably wealthy state, but they just simply don't have the schools, the hospitals, the roads, the housing to cope with that kind of influx.
The staggering new record, more migrants crossed into the U.S. on Monday than any other day in history.
The current crisis of forced displacement is a global phenomenon. There are more people displaced worldwide than ever before, and 1 out of every 5 displaced people is in the Americas.
But there's also pull factors, is that people have come to realize that if they reach the United States border and they seek asylum, then they'll be let in. And then their hearing will not happen for 7 years, during which time they are authorized to work in the United States and they won't be deported. And that has, I think, become a very important magnet.
Second of all, it's to make a point that those cities and states like New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco that claim that they are sanctuaries where anyone from anywhere in the world has the right to go there and live, those cities should put up or shut up.
In a strategy reminiscent of former President Trump's suggestions for managing undocumented migrants, other southern states like Arizona and Florida have also engaged in the practice of flying and busing migrants to sanctuary cities and states. Sanctuary cities refer to a community with a policy, written or unwritten, that discourages law enforcement from reporting an individual's immigration status unless it involves a serious crime.
They want more people in their sanctuary cities. Well, we'll give them more people. We can give them a lot. We can give them an unlimited supply. And let's see if they're so happy. They say we have open arms. They're always saying they have open arms. Let's see if they have open arms.
The actions of southern states have been criticized as a political stunt.
I think it's politically motivated. I mean, it's certainly not coming out of the goodness of heart or for the concern of the migrants. I mean, if the governor of Texas was concerned about migrants, which he alleged he was by busing them, then he would have consulted the mayors and the governors of the places he was sending them to. And he just said, look, this is a new national crisis. Let's all go together to President Biden and say this is a national crisis where the federal government has to take the lead in providing a solution. Instead of doing that, he just made it a political ploy for the cities to feel the pressure.
It's not just a publicity stunt. He is, yes, sharing the burden with states that have said that they can absorb it, but he's also trying to remove people from his state that he simply doesn't have the resources to cope with.
Critics also point out that the lack of coordination from Texas has made it more difficult for sanctuary cities to deal with the crisis.
If it happens slowly and organically, it's easier to deal with. When it happens in a spurt, and I think that's what happened in the case of the major northeastern cities, where in the new chapter of busing, a lot of migrants showed up. It was unexpected and unplanned for.
Well, what warning does Texas get when 300,000 people cross over every month? I think it's a bit rich for the mayors of cities up north to say, well, hang on a minute, can you guys just slow things down, give us some more warning, let us sort it out? I think that's a ploy. I think they should be talking to the White House because the White House has control over the flow. Texas doesn't have any control.
Please welcome to the stage, John Perkins.
Thank you. I stood in front of the Shah of Iran, the presidents of Indonesia,
Ecuador, Panama, members of the Royal House of Saudi Arabia, and I've said something like, in this hand, I have millions of dollars for you and your friends if you play our game. In this hand, I have a gun in case you decide not to. Now, my words were more diplomatic than that, but that was the message. I was an economic hitman. And we economic hitmen have created a new global economy, really, a form of capitalism that I call predatory capitalism. It isn't working. We all know this. The oceans are rising. The glaciers are melting. Less than 5% of us live here in the United States, and we consume almost 30% of the world's resources, while half the world is on the verge of starvation, or actually starving. That's not a model. China can't do it. India can't do it. They're trying, but they can't do it. We have to change. We have to have a revolution. We must change the system. I'll get into that in a minute, but first, how did I become an economic hitman? While I was still in business school, I was interviewed by the National Security Agency, the NSA. They put me through a series of extensive psychological tests, including on a lie detector. It's a long story, but to make a long story short, I ended up going in the Peace Corps and being sent deep into the Amazon rainforest. Now, I'd grown up the son of a teacher in a boys' prep school for very wealthy boys in rural New Hampshire. I grew up with lots of snow and cold, kind of like here in the winter, you know? And suddenly I find myself living in a thatched roof hut in the steamy jungle. You think I adjusted easily to that? After the Peace Corps, I then took a job. I was given a job as an economist at an international consulting firm in Boston with close ties to the NSA and the CIA. I was trained by a woman named Claudine Martin, whose job it was to train me to be an economic hitman. Now, Claudine had seen my NSA files. She knew that I wanted three things that I thought all my prep school buddies, the rich kids, had had: money, power, and sex. Claudine was really good at her job. And she promised me the first two: money and power. And she taught me quite a bit about the third. And then she told me what my job would entail. I would go to countries with resources our corporations covet, like oil. I'd arrange a huge loan to those countries from the World Bank or its sister organizations, but the money wouldn't actually go to the country. It would go to our corporations, Bechtel, Halliburton, Brown & Root, familiar names, to build big infrastructure projects in those countries and incidentally make huge profits in the process. They'd build power plants and industrial parks, things that would benefit a few wealthy families in the country, the ones that own the industries. But the majority of the people would suffer. They would be left holding a huge debt they couldn't repay. So we'd go back and say, since you can't pay your debt, sell your resource, oil or whatever, real cheap to our corporations. Privatize. Sell your utilities, your schools, your jails, everything like that to our corporations. And Claudine also told me that if the leaders of these countries refused my offer, people she called jackals would be right behind me. I didn't actually carry a gun, but the jackals did. My first assignment was in Indonesia, a country that had just ended a terrible civil war where more than 1 million people had been killed. It had a terrifying reputation. And I have to admit that when I arrived in Jakarta, knowing I'd be there for about 3 years, my knees were shaking pretty bad. My stomach was filled with fluttering butterflies. I had no idea what I was supposed to do. I was a very young man. I just knew that I was expected to produce a report that would convince the Indonesian government to build an extremely expensive electrical system, hiring our corporations to do it. Claudine had made it sound simple, even kind of James Bondishly romantic. But now I'm struck by reality, and I felt naive, ill-prepared, vulnerable. Fortunately for me, the winner of the Civil War President Suharto, who was actually a dictator, wanted the projects that I was offering. And he also wanted CIA and Pentagon protection. And so every time I stumbled, and I stumbled often, somebody was there to pick me up. A government official would appear with an incredible report that would indicate beyond any shadow of a doubt that electricity was all the country needed to take off to huge growth. A Harvard-trained mathematician showed up with a mathematical formula that proved that if they just built this electrical system, everything would be fine. In the end, I produced a report that forecasts the need for electricity at an unheard of annual rate of 19%. Indonesia got its loan. Our corporations made lots of money. And I was promoted from economist to chief economist. It was quite a lesson. At that time, the Cold War was just really, really revving up. And Washington believed that Cuba was about to spread communism throughout the hemisphere. The CIA developed a program called Operation Condor to support right-wing dictatorships in Brazil, Argentina, Chile, throughout the continent. Jaime Roldos, the president of Ecuador, democratically elected, and Omar Torrijos, head of state of Panama, strongly opposed Operation Condor. I was sent down to get them to change their ways. They wouldn't. They refused. Roldos was killed when his private plane crashed in what many believe was not an accident. Torrijos said, if CIA killed my friend Jaime, I'll probably be next. In less than 3 months, he died when his private plane crashed under very similar circumstances. You're going to hear after me, after the break, from a Marine Corps general who was in Panama at the time, and he agrees with me that these were probably, at least Torrijos was probably assassination. We don't really know who caused it. And I want to say that I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't believe in some overarching conspiracy to take over the world. But I do read reports. I think I'm a conspiracy factualist. You know, I read just recently declassified information, the CIA's own website, where they admit that the US government was deeply involved in the overthrow or assassination of Prime Minister Mossadegh of Iran, President Allende of Chile, Arbenz of Guatemala, Diem of Vietnam, Lumumba of the Congo. And speaking of Allende of Chile, he was replaced by the terribly brutal dictator, General Pinochet, who was a great defender of Operation Condor and also oversaw the murder of tens of thousands of his people, and was praised by Secretary of State Henry Kissinger as a great defender of capitalism. I believe in national security, and I don't believe that US security is served. I believe it's jeopardized when our agencies overthrow or assassinate the leaders of other countries because they don't follow our policies. I'm a capitalist. I think that capitalism has given us incredible technology, art, science, medicine. And I think it holds out the hope for the future. But there's this new form of capitalism that I call predatory capitalism that's the enemy of true capitalism. Let me explain. When I was in business school, I was taught that a good CEO makes a decent rate of return for his company and also makes sure his company is a good citizen. He pays his workers a fair wage, gives them health insurance and retirement pensions, pays taxes, imagine that, and supports local school and recreational facilities and so on and so forth. And in essence, he makes sure that his company serves a public interest. That all changed in 1976 when Milton Friedman won the Nobel Prize in economics and stated, amongst many other things, the only responsibility of business is to maximize profits, regardless of the social and environmental costs. It changed everything. And it has created this global fiasco, what I believe we're headed toward this disaster where we're in it a lot now with the climate change, with all the things that we all know is happening, and we must change that. And We can change that.
While it appears the banking system disruption may have been contained, the ripple effects will continue to impact the U.S. economy for months to come. The Fed's hiking of short-term interest rates above the yields available on long-term Treasury securities, that is, an inverted yield curve, has started to take a toll on the banking system. Interest rate risk is real, and managing that risk is more important than ever. Bank support of emerging companies will face headwinds. Many of these companies will need to acquire additional equity capital and funding over the next 16 to 18 months, or they may have to reduce payrolls. More mature technology companies with positive free cash flow are likely to cut back on their more risky long-term projects, leading to further job cuts in that sector. Virtually all banks will tighten credit standards, making new investment projects harder to finance over the whole economy.